Not a lot of licensed video games from the 2000s are remembered fondly. That's not to say all of them are bad. After all, even stuff like Knights of the Old Republic, one of my favorite games of all time, falls in this category. But licensed games based on properties aimed at a younger demographic certainly have a little bit of a bad reputation. And there's a good reason for this. In 90% of cases, these games were completely rushed out of the door to coincide with the big movie or TV special release. It's hard to think about this now, but there was a time where every new animated film got a video game. And not only that, they got like 8 different ports and versions of it. I mean, you could play Ratatouille on a Game Boy Advance or a PS3, and that's just hilarious to me, because the GBA is basically a souped up SNES and the PS3 has The Last of Us. You could go into Walmart and find 6 different versions of Over the Hedge or something, and that's just so wild for me to think about. This is a pretty funny rabbit hole to go down. Did you know that WALL-E is the only film in the Criterion Collection to have a video game adaptation? These games, though usually very flawed, truly are a relic of a bygone era, and I have kind of a soft spot for them for that very reason. Is Madagascar on PS2 really a masterpiece like I probably thought it was when I was 7? Of course not. But hey, it's actually a decent little time sink. I played a lot of these movie tie-in games as a kid, and I have fond memories of it, despite the fact that most of them are pretty mediocre. That being said, there was a series of licensed games that were released in the 2000s that I think really takes the cake when it comes to quality games based on popular properties. Spongebob SquarePants had plenty of video game releases in the 2000s, which ranged from acceptable but flawed to flat out annoying. It wasn't until the release of Battle for Bikini Bottom where Spongebob titles could not only appeal to hardcore fans of the show, but fans of 3D platformers in general. In this video, I'm going to look at the 3 games that cemented SpongeBob's status as a full-on 3D platforming mascot, up there with the likes of Spyro, Crash, Rayman, and more. Obviously, SpongeBob is a ridiculously popular property, and not one that I need to sit here and explain to you with a long-winded introduction. SpongeBob is SpongeBob, and it's one of the greatest series ever made, animated or not. But I am going to touch on how each game is able to feel like an episode of the show, and to what degree. I'm going to go in release order here, and also, as a side note, I'm going to be looking at the original release of Battle for Bikini Bottom in this video, especially as I'm comparing it to the next couple titles. I've played Rehydrated, and it's a great remake and totally viable and convenient way to play the game nowadays, but I can't say I don't prefer the original due to my own nostalgic biases. I do plan on looking at Rehydrated and Cosmic Shake in the future, but not in this video. That being said, let's get into it. As someone who really loves old collectathons like the Crash games and the first Jak and Daxter, Battle for Bikini Bottom is right up my alley. This is an incredibly solid 3D collectathon platformer, with a lot of admiration for the source material. What's really neat about this game is its commitment to presentation. It feels like an episode of the show in a lot of respects. It's clear that the writers had a lot of fun with it, and thankfully most of the voice cast is here. The writing is not quite to the same standard as the show, but there are some good moments and gags here. I love how they made a new model for SpongeBob and Sandy's tree dome. You can tell the devs actually watched the show and didn't just crap out a licensed game for a quick buck. There are a few obvious and glaring omissions here, namely the voices for Mr. Krabs and Mermaid Man, but it's not anything that ruins the experience. Battle for Bikini Bottom has a very familiar gameplay loop to anyone that's played other 3D collectathons, and that's a good thing. It takes the pre-established and successful formula of games like Super Mario 64 and Jak 1 and successfully integrates SpongeBob's world, vibe, and sense of humor. It's also worth mentioning that, like the aforementioned Jak and Daxter, because of the age of the genre when this game was released, there's a polish over this game that early collectathons like Super Mario 64 lack. I'm not trying to say that Battle for Bikini Bottom is better than Mario 64 or anything crazy like that, but this game has 7 years of hindsight into what makes a 3D platformer feel polished and fun, maintaining a decent level of challenge without making you want to pull your hair out. This doesn't mean that Battle for Bikini Bottom is a particularly unique game or that it stands head and shoulders ahead of other 3D collectathons. It just means that Battle for Bikini Bottom is a tight and polished experience. I'm not going to talk about the plot much. Basically, Plankton needs SpongeBob's help to get back into the chum bucket, after he creates a bunch of robots to take over Bikini Bottom with, but forgets to hit the hilariously cartoony obey switch that exists for some reason. The setup is classic 3D collectathon stuff. You have a hub world cut into 3 sections, each section containing levels that are locked behind a certain amount of golden spatulas, this game's main collectible. This is a gameplay loop that is very familiar to anyone who's played these types of games, but it works really well here. Specifically the game's more open nature compared to other linear platformers of the era. Yes, most of the levels themselves are pretty linear, and that's not a bad thing. The open nature of the game comes from how you approach it. Like many platformers, you don't have to 100% the game to beat it, meaning you don't have to collect every single golden spatula here, you only need 75 out of 100. This means that if a particular spatula is really getting on your nerves, the game accommodates for you provided you don't have an interest in completing it. You can skip entire levels this way if you really want to, or play some of them out of order. There are 2 kinds of collectathon. Games that value the player's time, and games that don't. And I'm glad to report that Battle for Bikini Bottom falls in the former category, even when completing it. I've mentioned the game's solid presentation, but it's worth noting that the decision not to use a more cel-shaded appearance, though valid, definitely dates the game graphically a little more than it had to. I overall still really enjoy the look of this game, but I could see how someone would much prefer the bright saturated colors of the rehydrated version. I'll also say that the animation doesn't feel bad at all, but doesn't stack up to the work done in recent Spongebob titles, which you would expect. Again, this is a licensed game from the early 2000s. It's honestly a miracle it's even this good at all, so I'm not trying to nitpick here. I'll also give a lot of credit to the game's levels. Some are more frustrating than others, but a majority of the levels here are a great time. I've always loved the first 3. Jellyfish Fields is a great opening level that gives you a solid microcosm of what the game has to offer. Downtown is a sprawling and huge level with multiple sections and some fun gliding parts. And Goo Lagoon is another well-designed, massive level with many different sections. All 3 of these levels have a great art style too, and feel faithful to the show. Other highlights include the Mermalair, the Dream levels, Rock Bottom, and more. There's even smaller but still very detailed areas in the hub world, like Squidward's Tiki House and Sandy's Tree Dome. I loved this part early on in the game where you can get a golden spatula just from jumping around and annoying Squidward. It could just be because I've played this game since I was a kid, but I've always thought the control here was really tight and precise. There are 3 playable characters. Spongebob, who has the most unique moves, Patrick, who can throw objects, and Sandy, who is able to glide with her lasso, making her gameplay really stand out. I enjoy playing as all the characters, and it's nice to switch it up and break up the pace of the game a little bit. As I touched on prior, there's a pretty neat hub world taking place in Bikini Bottom that separates levels. Every time you get enough golden spatulas to open a new section of the world, you have to do a boss fight with a giant robot. The Robot Sandy fight is a highlight for King Neptune's appearance alone, and I've always liked the design of the Robot Patrick fight. One thing I appreciate about the game is that even though it's certainly intended for a younger audience, it's not a complete pushover. There are still some challenging platforming sections, and the final boss actually kicked my ass as a kid. It's definitely not a hard game and really gave me no trouble on my most recent playthrough, but it's not so overly easy that you end up just going through the motions. I really appreciate the game's fast travel feature, which allows you to go back to any golden spatula you've received, and even lets you go back to certain challenges for spatulas you haven't received. This makes it so much easier to get spatulas that require moves that you unlock later in the game. Instead of having to go back to the hub world, go to downtown, then walk all the way to the Sea Needle, I can just open the pause menu and be right there in seconds. This is what I was talking about earlier when I said the game respects your time. It makes the game a lot more playable too. I never feel like this game is padded, and it seems to be around the perfect length to me. I could go on for a while about how much I love this game and how many times I've played and replayed it over the years. And though I've tried to review it objectively, I obviously have quite a bit of nostalgia wrapped up in it. To be fair and honest, it's not the greatest game in the entire world or anything, and isn't going to be a masterpiece to most people. But what I can say with confidence is that Battle for Bikini Bottom is a thoughtful and incredibly fun platformer that anyone can play and enjoy, particularly fans of 3D collectathons. I will take a second to briefly mention again Battle for Bikini Bottom Rehydrated. Rehydrated, as I'm sure you're aware, is a massive visual overhaul of the game released for modern systems. Most of the level design, audio design, and control is completely unchanged from the original, so I will say that it's a very faithful remake. remake. I want to review this game at a later date and discuss some of the differences between Rehydrated and the original, but I will say that something about this game doesn't hit quite the same for me. And as silly and unquantifiable as that is, it's the truth. That being said, it's still a great time, and if for convenience sake, or you just can't stand the old graphical style, I do recommend it if you want to play Battle for Bikini Bottom. So, Battle for Bikini Bottom performed really well on all 3 consoles it was released for. It's 2004, and Spongebob is at its highest popularity ever up to that point, with the movie releasing that year. And I mean, if Robots and Johnny Depp's Charlie and the Chocolate Factory got video game adaptations, you know that the Spongebob movie is absolutely going to get one. Thankfully, Nickelodeon went with Heavy Iron Studios when deciding a developer for the project, no doubt based on the success of Battle for Bikini Bottom. The first thing that you'll notice when booting up the movie game is its similarity to Battle for Bikini Bottom, not only graphically, but also in its controls and overall feel. This makes sense. There was only a year of development between titles, and it's also in no way a bad thing. Battle for Bikini Bottom feels great to play and serves as a good blueprint to the movie game. The movie game has some collectathon DNA inherited from the last game, but I'd say overall that this is a much more linear and straightforward 3D platformer, which also isn't a bad thing. While I miss the structure of Battle for Bikini Bottom when playing movie, the levels themselves are still quite fun, with branching pathways and multiple different challenges per level, similar to the first game. Scattered throughout every platform level are these little glowing squares which warp you to a short objective. These range from fun little distractions to actually becoming kind of annoying later on. There's the Spongebob challenge, the floating block challenge, and the arena challenge. The only one of these I actively kind of dislike is the arena challenge. The combat in these Spongebob games is perfectly serviceable, and I'll even concede that it's a lot more in-depth in this game compared to Battle thanks to its light RPG elements. But it's not the main focus, and when the game pivots to these combat arenas, it just doesn't feel like it's putting its best foot forward. They aren't bad, they're just pretty tedious, especially because the game gives you an infinite respawn of extra hits, removing most of the tension. I will say that the Spongebob and floating block challenge kind of remind me of that weird Spongebob PC game Obstacle Odyssey. Yeah, remember that one? Littered between traditional platforming levels are driving levels and sliding levels. I'm really torn on these because if all you had to do to beat the game was go through these once, I would really enjoy the change of pace. However, these levels expose one of movie games' biggest flaws. Every once in a while, usually when unlocking new abilities, the game blocks your progress until you get enough Goofy Goober tokens, this game's major collectible. That's not so bad on paper, right? Bikini Bottom did the same thing, just more directly in its hub world. The problem here is that movie games' requirements are less lenient and pretty much require you to do multiple time and ring challenges in the aforementioned driving and sliding levels. In Bikini Bottom, the golden spatula gates weren't just more lenient and therefore less frustrating, it incentivized multiple playstyles. I mean, you could get enough golden spatulas to go straight to the boss and get the Bubble Bowl within the first 2 levels, without going to Goo Lagoon. In this game, it's really frustrating. There's a point later on where the game has a requirement for you to have 50 tokens. I mean, yeah, it's on the last major level, but it's still a pretty big stone wall to be hit with at the end of the game. Another downgrade from Bikini Bottom is overall presentation, in my opinion. Now, the movie game does a pretty solid job at sticking to the plot of the first SpongeBob movie, which I love. And when it does this with in-game cutscenes and dialogues, it's really not bad. My problem with it lies in these kind of lazy slideshow cutscenes. Now, it might be a little unfair to call these lazy. Maybe there was some sort of legal thing that prevented them from just using clips of the movie. A lot of the frames they use are really unpolished, and some even look really lazily slapped together in Photoshop, which makes me think that Heavy Iron was given an early cut of the film and therefore not allowed to use real scenes from the movie. But it just seems like a downgrade from the previous game. I think Battle for Bikini Bottom was pretty lucky not to have to rely on a specific episode or movie, and because of that it has more of a tribute vibe. Maybe I'm just overanalyzing a game made for kids, but that game feels like a love letter to the series, and like the people behind it genuinely had admiration for the source material. Movie game feels like this too, it's just that the impact is not quite the same, since they had to pretty much copy the movie's plot verbatim. Another aspect of the game's presentation that is a downgrade downgrade, in my opinion, is the music. Now, I didn't really mention the soundtrack in Battle for Bikini Bottom, and that's because while it is solid and perfectly serviceable, it's nothing incredible. It's SpongeBob sounding music and it fits the game just fine. I can say most of the same for the movie game. The game even has a banger final boss track, but there's a couple of tracks here that are just super grating for some reason. Look, I know a lot of people are nostalgic for this stuff, and I am too, but let's be honest with ourselves here. This is penis music. The highlights of the game for me are definitely in the platforming levels, with each of them feeling really well designed and fun. And though I complained about them earlier, the driving and sliding levels are fun as well. My problem with the driving and sliding isn't really the levels themselves, it's just about them overstaying their welcome. Think about Ratchet and Clank 2. When it has ship levels or hoverbike races, one is required to progress in the story, and then there are optional ones for extra money and collectibles. This is the approach they should have taken with Movie Game. I think the reason they didn't is unfortunately because they probably knew they needed to pad the game out. It's not a long game anyway, but would be especially short without the token requirements. I'm not really opposed to these requirements as much as I just think the amount of tokens needed should be reduced. You may remember earlier in the video I praised Battle for Bikini Bottom for being a collectathon that values your time. Going into this game, you might think, okay, they're leaving behind the collectathon approach. This is probably just going to be a short and sweet linear platformer. And though this game still has some time-saving features I appreciated in the last game, like fast travel points, Movie doesn't really value your time quite as much as Battle for Bikini Bottom. In that game, it felt like you could go through it at your own pace, fast or slow. Then if you wanted to see what else was left and complete the game, you could do that with little to no frustration. In Movie Game, it sometimes feels like the game is forcing you to complete the annoying parts so that you can get to the good parts. Anyway, I know this sounds all pretty negative, but don't get me wrong. Movie Game is a good 3D platformer. There are times where it borders on great, with some of its later platforming levels coming to mind. Even more so than Battle for Bikini Bottom, the game really isn't a pushover, and has a decent challenge to it for a game marketed towards a younger demographic. The bosses are piss easy besides the final boss, which is a slight disappointment after Battle for Bikini Bottom had such well-designed boss fights. But other than that, I'd say the game is a fair challenge. One thing they added that I think is an improvement over Battle for Bikini Bottom is the upgrade system. Instead of money just being a way to buy more of the main collectible, it's used to upgrade your abilities and health in this game. And shockingly, I don't think there was a single upgrade here that wasn't useful, especially in late game. There's one for SpongeBob and Patrick that deflects enemy projectiles, a really satisfying one for SpongeBob's uppercut that explodes with a button press, standard health upgrades, and more. This is really cool. Unlike Bikini Bottom, where you just get a new ability after a boss fight, and that's the same ability you keep for the entire duration of the game, this game has you improving your character as you play, giving Movie Game a very slight RPG element. And I can't be the only one who thinks that light RPG elements work amazingly in a platformer context. Once again, it reminds me of Ratchet 2, the first game in that series to focus on RPG mechanics. And the classic vertical progression as you upgrade your health and abilities works so well for me in platformers from this era. Don't get me wrong, I wish the game didn't slow you down to a grinding halt, making you backtrack through its worst sections to give you new abilities. But the sense of progression does genuinely work here. Overall, I know I ragged on it a little bit, but aside from some glaring but forgivable flaws, the Movie Game is a worthy sequel to Battle for Bikini Bottom, and a decent platformer in its own right. Does it come close to Battle's heights? In my opinion, no. It's definitely a downgrade. But that's okay. That game was honestly kind of a lightning in a bottle thing. Everything from the genre to the source material to the year it came out lined up just right to make that game an instant classic. The Movie Game unfortunately has some missteps that prevented it from being remembered quite as fondly. But it is still well far and above what you would expect for a licensed movie tie-in platformer. The controls are tight, the levels are well designed, the abilities and upgrades are really satisfying, and overall, the SpongeBob SquarePants Movie Game is a really good time. Now, if you're like me, for the longest time, this is where the story ends with the Heavy Iron SpongeBob games. Movie Game and Battle were the two I had as a kid and the ones I have fond memories of. But there was a third 3D platformer made by Heavy Iron Studios with the Spongebob license. Truth or Square was released for a lot of platforms, but we'll be looking at the 360 port, which, by the way, is backwards compatible with the Xbox One and Series consoles if you want to give it a shot yourself. This game came out 5 years after Movie Game, meaning it's kind of Heavy Iron's big return to the Spongebob series. And you'll feel that right off the bat, not only in the game's models and art style, but even in its soundtrack, which is unfortunately completely comprised of songs from the previous two games and a few from the show, but we'll touch more on that later. I'm not sure how many people who grew up with Movie Game and Battle for Bikini Bottom even knew this game existed, but I wasn't one of them. I've only known about it for a couple years and haven't actually played it until this video. Interestingly, looking online at the few high quality reviews of this game that exist, it seems to be a pretty widely disliked game. Maybe not hated, but definitely at least just tolerated. I'm happy to say that for the most part, I disagree with this sentiment. Though the game is based on a TV special, it doesn't really have much to do with its plot, and I'm actually really cool with this. Instead, Truth or Square takes the clip show route. I think this premise works for a show with as many iconic episodes as SpongeBob. Ultimately though, it is kind of an excuse to reuse assets and level ideas from Battle for Bikini Bottom, which is why when you see things like the salty spittoon in this game, it doesn't look exactly like its counterpart in the show, but that's fine with me. The only time it gets a little annoying is the sheer amount of reused level ideas and music. There's a Jellyfish Fields level, a Kelp Forest level, a Murmelair inspired level, all using the same music as their respective levels in Battle. The game continues the trilogy's turn to linearity, with this one being by far the most straightforward of the three. There is technically a hub world, but you just warp to levels straight up instead of having the more diegetic approach of Battle for Bikini Bottom's hub world. There's no upgrade system like Movie Game, and no way to play later levels early like Battle. This is a bog standard basic platformer, but that really doesn't make it a bad game. I actually really like Truth or Square. I like its art style, I like its levels, and playing this game was a treat to someone like me who's always enjoyed the other two Heavy Iron SpongeBob games. I mean, it's not perfect. It's really short and really easy, and definitely feels like the least ambitious title in this trilogy, but honestly I do think it's pretty confidently pulled off. Instead of upgrading or gaining new abilities as you progress, this game has power-ups scattered throughout each level, with all of them being super overpowered. They're pretty fun to use though, and allow you to briefly play as other characters like Patrick, Sandy, and even Squidward. But it's not as interesting as the different playable characters with whole new movesets that were present in the previous two titles. There's one power-up here that doesn't have a timer on it, which makes it insanely overpowered. It only goes away once you take a hit. It's pretty fun to use, and you want to hold on to it because it does double damage, but annoyingly, this game has the trope of blasting music at you that isn't the stage music. Think the Werehog levels in Sonic Unleashed and its obnoxious battle music. It's actually an iconic song from the show that plays while you have this power-up, but I was so sick of hearing it by the end of the game. Petty nitpicks aside, I really don't have all too much to say about Truth or Square. I feel like it's really just a fun game. Is it better than the other two? It's definitely not better than Battle for Bikini Bottom, and it's probably not better than Movie either. But if I'm being perfectly honest, and I know this is gonna piss people off, I think that this game got on my nerves a lot less than Movie Game did. The animation here is great, way better than the other two. The game holds up graphically for being an old 360 title, the platforming is fun and varied, and the combat feels pretty satisfying overall. This is a quality 3D platformer that I feel gets overlooked in the conversation of solid licensed games. Yeah, it's gonna help a lot if you like SpongeBob and specifically the other two in the Heavy Iron trilogy, but I'm not really sure where the poor review scores and overall distaste of this title comes from. It's also possible I just went into it with low expectations and was just happy to find this kind of lost third title in this trilogy. If you're like I was and have only ever played the first two, I highly recommend Truth or Square. I was surprised at just how much I enjoyed my time with it. I'd say whether you played these games as a kid and haven't replayed them in years, or just love 3D platformers and need more games to satisfy that craving, each of these titles are well worth your time. The bar of quality is really low for licensed games in the mid to late 2000s, but each of these titles exceed those expectations and then some, standing as a trilogy of good platformers first and licensed tie-ins second. The good news is that Rehydrated made Battle for Bikini Bottom accessible on all modern platforms. It goes for $30 MSRP, and though I think that's worth it, it goes on sale all the time, and used copies go for less than $10 on eBay right now. Of course, the other two don't have the remake treatment, so for those two, and if you want to just play the original Battle, I will say I was able to get all three running through emulation on PC. Just like in my Skate video, I was able to get Truth or Square running through Xenia with small graphics issues. I just think that's worth bringing up because a lot of people might not be aware just how much 360 emulation on PC has progressed in the last couple of years. I'd also like to briefly mention the Cosmic Shake again. I've actually been playing it and really enjoying it, and I plan on making a video about it if this one does well. Maybe another trilogy video with Rehydrated, Cosmic Shake, and the Patrick Star game? Let me know in the comments if that's something you'd be interested in. Thanks for watching.